The tenants' gathering at Ashford Hollow had always been a polite affair, a yearly ritual meant to demonstrate harmony between the estate and the modest families who worked its land, yet this particular afternoon carried an unusual sharpness in the air. Sunlight spilled across the lawns, illuminating ribbons, bonnets and polished boots, but beneath the cheerful trimmings simmered the quiet cruelty of whispered judgment. Mrs. Clara Harwood felt those whispers long before she heard them, felt them in the way a pair of ladies glanced her way and immediately lowered their voices, in the way another shifted her skirts to avoid brushing past her, as though widowhood were contagion rather than misfortune. She held her poise with practiced composure, smoothing her son's hair and encouraging him to stay near, though she knew well that 7-year-old boys were not made for stillness. Thomas tugged at her hand, eager to explore, and she allowed him a small distance, trusting that her steady reminders would keep him out of trouble. Yet trouble, as it often does for small boys, arrived in a heartbeat. Thomas collided with Lady Henswick, a severe woman whose feathers and pride were equally tall, sending a splash of cider across her ivory gloves. A hush rippled through the nearby guests. Clara stepped forward at once, apologizing with earnest sincerity, but Lady Henswick seized the moment with vindictive pleasure. She scolded Clara's careless upbringing, her lack of supervision, her inability to control even one child, each remark delivered loudly enough to ensure an audience. Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from guilt but from humiliation. She kept her eyes lowered, her voice respectful, knowing that any protest would only feed the flames. Thomas clung to her skirt, wide-eyed and frightened, whispering an apology that Lady Henswick dismissed with a disdainful sniff. Nearby, the musicians faltered before resuming their melody, and the crowd attempted to return to conversation, yet Clara could feel the sting lingering in the air like smoke. She gathered Thomas close, offering him a gentle reassurance, though her own heart trembled under the weight of public judgment. She wished only to retreat somewhere quiet, but she could sense that the day had more to reveal, more eyes upon her, more scrutiny, more chances for her dignity to fray. For above the murmuring crowd, observing from a distance known only to the lonely, stood the Duke of Ashford, Elias Ravensfield, though Clara was not yet aware of his presence. Elias had watched the scene unfold with the detachment of a man long estranged from society's games. Tall, impeccably dressed, and marked by the lingering shadow of grief, he appeared as though carved from the same stone as the manor's pillars. 6 years earlier, he had lost both wife and child, and the tragedy had reshaped him into someone the nobility viewed with a mixture of pity, fascination, and frustrated expectation. He was required to remarry, to secure an heir, to rejoin the world of conversation and courtship, yet his heart resisted with quiet stubbornness. The laughter and chatter around him felt hollow, more performance than pleasure, and so he slipped away from the gathering as he always did, seeking the solace of his private garden behind the main lawn. The garden welcomed him with its familiar stillness. Beneath the great yew tree, he breathed more freely, though sorrow clung to him like a second coat. He removed his gloves and rested them on the stone bench, letting the cold wind steady the ache that words could not. He told himself he preferred solitude, that isolation protected what remained of him, yet even he sensed that solitude had begun to erode rather than preserve. He pressed a hand to his brow, feeling the heaviness that never quite lifted, and allowed himself a rare moment of unguarded vulnerability. It was in that unguarded moment that Thomas wandered into the garden. Small feet pattered across the gravel path until the boy halted, unsure whether he had intruded upon something sacred. Elias, hearing the sound, lifted his gaze and found the child staring at him with disarming sincerity. There was no fear, no hesitation, only a child's instinctive concern. Elias attempted a faint, polite smile, but Thomas's brow wrinkled at the sight of the man's grief, which even the Duke's impeccable posture could not disguise. In the soft, trembling voice of someone too young to censor kindness, Thomas stepped closer and said, "Don't cry, sir, you can have my mamma." The words struck Elias with unexpected force. Something inside him, the part still aching, still searching, shifted. He stared at the boy, unable to summon an immediate reply. Before he could speak, Clara hurried into the garden, relief and mortification warring across her face. She dropped into a graceful curtsy, apologizing for her son's intrusion, expecting the Duke's displeasure and bracing herself for consequences she could not afford. Elias, however, rose to his feet with measured calm, shaking his head before she could finish. His voice, though low, carried an uncommon warmth as he said, "Madam, your son has more courage than the entirety of Parliament." Clara lifted her gaze, startled. Elias studied her with quiet curiosity, not the condescension she anticipated. There was something steady in her posture despite her embarrassment, something resilient in the way she shielded her son. The moment held them briefly, suspended between apology and understanding, until Thomas tugged at Clara's sleeve, sensing adult tensions he could not explain. She thanked the Duke with sincere humility and prepared to leave at once, but Elias halted her gently. He did not scold her, did not dismiss her, did not send her away with the cold formality she expected. Instead, he asked her name, not out of idle politeness, but with the deliberate interest of a man who had unexpectedly encountered a spark in the dim corners of his life. Clara offered her name with cautious composure, uncertain why the Duke would care to hear it. Elias nodded slowly, as though committing it to memory. He said nothing more, but the silence between them felt strangely full, as though the air itself recognized the beginning of something neither had sought. Clara excused herself with a careful curtsy, guiding Thomas back toward the main grounds, her heartbeat unsteady with confusion. She did not look back, though she sensed the Duke's gaze lingering a moment longer than propriety allowed. Elias remained beneath the yew tree, unsettled yet curiously lighter. He could not explain it, but the boy's innocent offering, and the mother's quiet dignity, had stirred something long dormant. And though duty, grief, and propriety pressed upon him as heavily as ever, he found himself issuing an unexpected instruction to his steward as he returned to the manor, that Mrs. Clara Harwood be summoned to his study on the following morning. The decision surprised even him, yet he did not reconsider. Something had shifted. He felt it with the certainty of a tide turning. And whether it proved folly or fate, he sensed the course of his quiet life had just begun to change. Clara arrived at the Duke's study the next morning with an anxious steadiness, determined to show humility despite the uncertainty beneath her composure. The manor's servants regarded her with guarded curiosity, their glances quick and appraising. When she entered the study, Elias stood near the hearth, winter light falling pale across his shoulders. He greeted her politely but with a sincerity that startled her. He thanked her for her son's bravery, then retrieved a small wooden soldier carved from the yew tree beneath which they had met. He offered it not as charity but as honor, calling Thomas's gesture an act of uncommon heart. Clara accepted the gift with trembling hands, moved by a thoughtfulness she had never expected from a duke. Outside, whispers stirred almost instantly. Servants carried news like wind along the corridors. By midday, the estate buzzed with speculation. Why had the Duke summoned a tenant widow, and why had she stayed long enough to receive a crafted token? Clara felt eyes following her as she returned home. She set the wooden soldier on the mantel, watching Thomas marvel at it, unaware of the attention it had roused. She tried to believe the gesture bore no deeper meaning, yet her pulse betrayed her whenever she remembered Elias's softened expression. Word of the encounter reached Lady Beatrice by afternoon. Renowned for ambition and a tongue sharpened by envy, she arranged a visit to Clara's cottage under the guise of kindness. Clara received her with polite reserve, already uneasy at the lady's overly sweet tone. Beatrice surveyed the modest home with thinly disguised disdain before delivering accusations wrapped in civility. She implied Clara encouraged inappropriate familiarity, that she used her child to gain sympathy, that a duke would never look twice at a woman with neither fortune nor lineage. Clara listened with her hands clasped tightly, attempting to maintain dignity despite the sting of every word. The exchange might have continued had Elias not appeared at the doorway, having arrived to deliver a message regarding estate matters. His presence altered the room at once. Beatrice fell silent, stiffening as she faced the man whose approval she sought yet had never secured. Elias's expression cooled as he perceived the tone of the conversation. He addressed Clara with courtesy before turning his restrained displeasure toward Beatrice. Without raising his voice, he made it clear that Clara deserved respect, not insult, and that any slight against her would reflect poorly on the speaker. Beatrice withdrew in a whirl of silks, her pride wounded, her ambitions unsettled. Elias then offered to escort Clara to the gate so they might speak privately. She hesitated, aware of how easily such a moment could be misconstrued, yet his sincerity disarmed her caution. They walked slowly along the path, winter air sharp but peaceful. Elias apologized for Beatrice's conduct, though he bore no blame. Clara accepted graciously, though confusion tugged at her. Why should a duke concern himself so deeply with her comfort? The question lingered even after he bid her good day with a faint smile warmer than she expected. In the days that followed, their paths crossed with increasing frequency. Elias visited the village school to inquire after improvements and found Clara volunteering with unassuming diligence. Clara brought Thomas to the orchards to collect fallen apples and found Elias surveying wintering trees. These meetings, though brief, grew steadily more familiar, as if circumstance insisted on drawing them together. Their conversations remained proper, yet carried small, revealing shifts, moments where Elias's voice gentled or Clara's eyes brightened at a shared remark. Thomas grew particularly attached to the Duke, speaking to him with bold affection that amused Elias and unsettled Clara. The estate noticed these moments with sharpening interest. Gossip traveled quickly, reshaping coincidence into conjecture. Some claimed Clara sought to ensnare Elias, others insisted the Duke's grief had left him vulnerable to unsuitable company. Clara felt the pressure of these murmurs with every step beyond her cottage. She withdrew from the manor grounds, hoping to calm the speculation, yet the retreat only deepened suspicions. Elias observed her sudden distance and sought her out, asking if he had offended her. Clara, flustered by his concern, reassured him with careful honesty. Their conversation ended with a pause whose silence felt more revealing than words. That evening, Clara stood at her window as dusk settled, watching Thomas march the wooden soldier across the table. The token had become more than a child's treasure. It had become the quiet emblem of a connection growing more swiftly than she could rationalize. She felt gratitude mingled with apprehension, sensing that what began as kindness was evolving into something heavier. She feared the consequences, yet each unexpected meeting with Elias left her heart stirred in ways she had not felt since before widowhood reshaped her life. The estate's gossip stretched beyond its borders sooner than expected. A rumor, sharpened by eager tongues, traveled to London. By week's end, word returned. The Duke of Ashford was said to be courting beneath his rank. Clara received this news not as possibility but as danger, for she understood what such talk could unleash. The nobility could be merciless when protecting its own boundaries. She extinguished the candles and sat in the dim glow of the hearth, realizing that her quiet life had shifted beyond her control. Whether by fate or folly, she stood on the edge of a change she had no strength to stop, yet no true desire to flee. She sensed the approaching storm, its first winds stirring through her thoughts, warning that the days ahead would test every ounce of resilience she possessed. The invitation to the Ashford midwinter gathering arrived with the Duke's seal pressed carefully into the wax, its weight both beautiful and alarming in Clara's trembling hands. She had not expected Elias to extend such a gesture, not after the rumors that had seeped across the estate, but the elegant script made his intention unmistakable. He wished her presence. Her first instinct was refusal, for she knew well how society observed a widow of modest means, especially one whispered to have captured a duke's attention. Yet Thomas watched her with bright anticipation when he saw the envelope, and something in her heart resisted the idea of shrinking from an evening the Duke had personally offered. She spent hours debating the matter, tuning her emotions like a fragile instrument, until she resolved to attend with quiet dignity rather than fear. When she arrived at the manor on the evening of the gathering, she entered beneath cascades of candlelight and winter greenery. Though dressed in her best gown, she still felt conspicuously simple among the silk-clad nobility. Conversations faltered as some guests noted her arrival, others pretended not to see her at all. Clara kept her chin raised, though the pressure of every judging glance grew heavier with each step. She found a place near the edge of the ballroom, hoping to remain unnoticed, yet whispers reached her even in the corners. Remarks on her background, her widowhood, the impropriety of appearing unaccompanied among the aristocracy. Still, she stood her ground, unwilling to let shame define her evening. Elias noticed her before she saw him. From across the ballroom, his gaze settled upon her with a quiet protectiveness, his expression softening in a way few ever witnessed. He approached with measured steps, every eye subtly tracking his path, and offered her a greeting so warmly spoken she felt the chill of the room ease for a moment. He asked after Thomas, after her health, after her comfort. Though his words were proper, his tone betrayed a deeper concern that could not be hidden. Clara responded carefully, conscious of how their exchange must appear, yet grateful for the rare safety his presence gave her. He escorted her to a quieter alcove, where the music hummed more softly, and engaged her in conversation with a gentleness that made the world beyond their space momentarily irrelevant. But serenity rarely lasts in a room filled with ambition. Lady Beatrice, splendid in winter blue, had been waiting for the moment Clara slipped from the crowd into a more vulnerable position. She approached with an air of cordiality so rehearsed it struck Clara as colder than disdain. Beatrice's words came wrapped in politeness yet sharpened by envy, suggesting that Clara's appearance was courageous, though courage, she implied, should not be mistaken for propriety. Clara attempted to disengage gracefully, but the lady pressed on, gathering the attention of nearby guests who found entertainment in the quiet tension. The confrontation escalated when Beatrice allowed a cruel remark to escape under the guise of concern, that tenant widows should be mindful of their aspirations, for the higher one reached, the further one might fall. Clara felt the sting sharply, but before she could form a reply, Elias appeared beside her with a command in his posture that silenced those listening. His gaze burned not with anger but with an icy disappointment that struck deeper. He addressed Beatrice in a tone firm enough to halt any further cruelty, reminding her, without raising his voice, that a lady's conduct was measured not by her birth but by her treatment of others. Beatrice withdrew, wounded by the rebuke, leaving Clara shaken yet grateful beyond words. Elias guided Clara toward the conservatory, sensing her need for quiet refuge. The glass walls glowed with moonlight, casting soft reflections across the frosted panes. Here, away from the audience of the ballroom, an unusual stillness embraced them. Clara tried to compose herself, apologizing for causing discomfort or scandal, but Elias interrupted gently, insisting the fault lay nowhere near her. He spoke with unguarded sincerity, confessing that her presence eased the loneliness he had carried for years, that her kindness had become something he sought without meaning to. His honesty unsettled her, for it unraveled the careful distance she had tried to maintain. Clara admitted she feared the scrutiny surrounding them. She feared how easily society dismantled women who crossed invisible boundaries, how quickly compassion could be twisted into ambition. She told him she admired him deeply yet believed their worlds were not built to intertwine without cost. Elias listened without interruption, absorbing every word as though it revealed something vital about the woman standing before him. When she finished, he stepped closer, not in boldness, but in a quiet certainty that made her breath catch. He replied that he had spent 6 years honoring society's expectations and received nothing in return but solitude, and that he would no longer permit fear to dictate the shape of his life. The moment drew them together until mere inches separated them, the air between them thick with unspoken longing. Clara felt the pull of emotions she had long suppressed, emotions she had believed herself unworthy to hold again. Elias reached for her hand, brushing her knuckles with a touch so light it felt like a vow. Yet before the moment could deepen further, Thomas appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from his eyes, having been brought by one of the caretakers at his earlier request to find his mother. His presence dissolved the fragile tension, but not the truth it had revealed. Clara lifted Thomas into her arms, offering Elias a look filled with gratitude and uncertainty. Elias smiled faintly at the child, though the tenderness in his eyes was unmistakably meant for her. The interruption served as a reminder that affection, however heartfelt, could not remain hidden forever. They returned to the ballroom where the music played on, though Clara sensed that something irrevocable had shifted in the conservatory's quiet shadows. In the days that followed, the gossip intensified with merciless speed. A London paper printed Clara's name in thinly veiled speculation, and the estate's whispers grew sharper. Clara realized she could not allow Elias's reputation, or Thomas's future, to be stained by her presence. With a heavy heart, she prepared to leave Ashford Hollow, planning to return to her distant relatives before dawn. She packed quietly, smoothing Thomas's hair as he slept, whispering promises of safety she hoped she could keep. But before she could depart, a knock sounded at the cottage door. Elias stood there, breath visible in the cold morning air, having ridden through frost-covered fields with urgency etched across his features. He stepped inside without waiting for permission, his determination radiating through the dim cottage. Clara attempted to explain her intention, but he shook his head fiercely. He would not allow her to vanish from his life under the weight of false judgment. He spoke with clarity, with resolve, and with a tenderness that broke the last of her restraint. He proposed marriage, plainly, honestly, not out of duty, but love. Clara hesitated, fear battling hope, until Thomas stirred awake, saw Elias, and wrapped his arms around the Duke with familiar affection. "Please don't cry again, sir," he whispered. Elias knelt, meeting the child's eyes, then Clara's, offering a future shaped not by fear but courage. Clara felt her resistance dissolve, replaced by the quiet recognition that fate had brought them to this threshold. She placed her trembling hand in his, accepting not only his proposal but the life he offered. Thus began the resolution of their quiet, improbable journey, a decision forged in humility, strengthened in adversity, and sealed in the early light of dawn, where two lives once shaped by sorrow finally found their way toward hope.